It started like any ordinary traffic stop, under the scorching sun on a dusty provincial highway, where routine checks blur into background noise. But that day, a young woman riding an old motorbike was pulled over for what seemed like a minor infraction, a missing side mirror. No drama. No shouting. Just a soft-spoken voice asking the officer one simple question. What no one expected, least of all the officer himself, was what she pulled from her bag next. Not a wallet. Not her ID. But something that would send chills down the spines of the entire department, and ripple through the highest ranks of government. Because sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truths. And sometimes what looks like a casual encounter is a calculated strike. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement of Highway 14, where time seemed to slow between the dust and the distant honks of passing trucks. A young woman, no older than 25, eased her motorbike to the shoulder as the traffic officer waved her over. There was no panic in her eyes, no defiance in her body language, only a strange calm as if she had expected this moment. Your side mirror is missing, the officer announced, his tone routine, almost bored. She nodded politely. No excuse, no argument. Just the gentle rustling of her bag as she reached inside. The officer's eyes scanned her cautiously. She looked like a student or an office worker, clean, modestly dressed, barely noticeable. The kind of person you'd forget moments after seeing. But then she asked softly, "May I ask why this checkpoint is here? There's no posted warning sign, and you're stopping only certain bikes." The officer hesitated. That wasn't the kind of question he was used to. He shrugged it off, muttering something vague about public safety. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out a thick envelope. Sealed, official looking. Labeled with a classification mark that officers like him were trained to recognize, but never expected to see handed over on a roadside. "This," she said, her voice still calm, "is what your superior has been avoiding for the past 6 months. And I suggest you read it very carefully." The air changed. Suddenly the checkpoint didn't feel like a checkpoint anymore. It felt like the opening move of a much larger game, one the officer hadn't even known he was a part of. Because this wasn't about a missing mirror. It was about exposing what was hiding behind the mirror. He took the envelope from her hands with a mix of irritation and unease. It was heavier than it looked, weighted not just with paper but with implication. The red stamp on the front read, "Confidential, Level 3 clearance required." He wasn't authorized to open it. But in that moment, something in the young woman's gaze made him feel as though he needed to. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stood there, as if waiting for a truth long overdue. He called over his supervisor. Within minutes, 3 more officers appeared, including a lieutenant with dark sunglasses and an expression carved from years of protocol. The envelope changed hands. There was muttering, subtle nods, the sound of a radio crackling to life. Then silence. As the lieutenant skimmed the documents inside, his expression stiffened. The young woman watched with quiet focus. He flipped through pages stamped with seals from the Ministry of Justice, an interagency audit, and, most alarmingly, a list of officers involved in unauthorized roadside operations. Operations just like the one she had been stopped at. "This checkpoint," she said, breaking the silence, "is illegal. There's no ministerial decree authorizing your presence here. And these photos," she gestured to the file, "show 2 of your men collecting money from drivers off the books. One of them is standing right there." She pointed. All eyes turned toward a junior officer whose face went pale. He instinctively reached for his radio, then thought better of it. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Suddenly this wasn't just an encounter. It was a reckoning. And the woman? She wasn't just a bystander. She was the messenger of a truth someone had worked very hard to bury. For a fleeting moment, time itself seemed to stall. The dusty highway, once filled with the dull hum of idling engines and impatient horns, fell into an uncanny stillness, as if even the air refused to move without knowing how this would end. The lieutenant lowered the last page of the dossier slowly, deliberately. His silence spoke louder than any order. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, flicked between the young woman and the officer she had just accused. "You're from Internal Affairs," he finally said, not as a question but a reluctant realization. The woman smiled softly, just enough to confirm without bragging. "Second Division. Attached temporarily to the Ministry of Public Integrity. My mandate was to approach this checkpoint under neutral cover, and observe." Her voice was steady, calm. Not cold but controlled, like someone used to walking straight into storms and documenting where the lightning hits. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. Another avoided her gaze completely. Then she pulled out a small recorder from her back pocket. "I was instructed to hand this over after my identity was compromised," she said, placing it in the lieutenant's hand. A click. Static. Then voices. Clear as day, one of the officers demanding a handling fee from a driver, while another laughed about how easy it was to skim from randoms who couldn't tell a legal stop from a roadside scam. Voices identifiable by name, by tone, by arrogance. This wasn't just paperwork now. It was evidence. The young woman turned slightly, scanning the gathered crowd of civilians still watching from their cars. She raised her voice, not to provoke but to project truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, you were right to question this stop. There was no legal basis for it. And no, the missing side mirror was never the real issue." The atmosphere changed. Windows rolled down. A few drivers clapped, softly at first, then louder. Horns tapped like applause. Some officers reached instinctively for their belts, for control. But it was too late. The story had broken free. And so had the people. The accused officer, Sergeant Hung, stood motionless. His lips parted, but no words came. For a man who just hours ago barked orders and smirked at frightened drivers, he now looked like a figure shrinking under invisible weight. The lieutenant turned toward him, voice low but sharp as steel. "Do you deny this is your voice?" Hung swallowed, glanced at his fellow officers, but none returned his gaze. The badge that had once made him untouchable now felt more like a target. He opened his mouth, but the only sound that emerged was a pathetic rasp. The young woman stepped closer, her calm presence now magnetic. She pulled another folded sheet from her folder, this one printed with bank transactions, times, vehicle tags, and a name circled in red. "It wasn't just petty bribery," she said. "Your team registered multiple unreported fines over the past 3 months. One of which involved a tourist who never made it past this checkpoint. His family filed a complaint. You closed the report without investigation." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. And then, one voice rose from the crowd. "That was my cousin. They told us he drove away safely." Silence fell like a curtain. The officer's eyes widened. For the first time, fear, not of exposure but of consequence, truly registered on his face. Lieutenant Bao stepped forward, not as a colleague, but as a commander accepting the weight of a rotting branch he'd been ordered to cut. "Sergeant Hung," he said, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending full investigation." 2 other officers stepped forward to escort Hung, now trembling, to the patrol car. The same one he once leaned on arrogantly while shaking down civilians. From the back of the crowd, a woman whispered, "Finally." Someone listened. But the girl from Internal Affairs hadn't finished. She turned to the remaining officers, scanning their faces with quiet precision. "This isn't just about one man," she said. "It's about a culture. One where silence protects the wrong people. That culture ends today." And just like that, what started as a simple traffic stop had transformed into a reckoning. A moment passed. Then another. The crowd stood still, caught between disbelief and awakening, until a quiet, broken voice pierced the silence. I have something to say." It was Officer Min, the youngest among the patrol team. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now shimmered with something else, shame. He stepped forward slowly as if dragging the weight of months, or years, of silence behind him. "I knew it was wrong," he said, voice trembling. "We were told it was just how things were done. That if we wanted to keep our jobs we looked away, or played along." No one interrupted. Not even the lieutenant. Min continued, "The bribes, the threats, the way people were made to feel powerless. It wasn't just Hung. It was all of us. Some more than others. Some too scared to stop it." He turned toward the woman from Internal Affairs. No longer just a stranger with a folder, but the only one in that moment who seemed to represent something larger. Something true. "I'm ready to tell everything. But not just to protect myself. To clean up what we let rot." A hush settled over the crowd. But what followed wasn't judgment, it was something closer to a quiet respect. The kind reserved for those who dare to rise, even from their knees. The lieutenant gave a small nod, and the young woman extended her hand, not in arrest but in invitation. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, 2 other officers, veterans of the same post, looked at each other then stepped forward too. Not all the way. Not with words. But enough to signal what was coming. The wall of silence had cracked. And through the crack, came light. Meanwhile, the civilians who had gathered, drivers, vendors, a mother clutching her child, watched in awe. Not because justice had arrived wearing sirens and handcuffs, but because it had arrived calmly, dressed in truth, and carried in the hands of a girl no one saw coming. For the first time, the checkpoint no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed were nothing short of transformative. News of the incident spread, not through sensational headlines, but through whispers of admiration and hope. People didn't just talk about a sting operation or a corrupt outpost being dismantled. They spoke of the young woman in the gray coat, who asked no one for applause, yet left a crowd breathless with the truth she carried. But what few knew was that this was never meant to be a grandstand. The woman, now identified as Agent Lean from Internal Affairs, had been investigating this nexus of corruption for nearly 8 months. What began as a quiet trail of complaints from locals had grown into a full-scale covert operation. She didn't act alone. There were others like her, embedded, listening, waiting. Men and women working in silence, watching the cracks in the system widen. Her briefcase. It hadn't just contained documents. It held testimonies, hidden recordings, marked transactions, and most damning of all, a ledger that linked high-ranking officers to external rackets far beyond that lone checkpoint. And yet, she never raised her voice. Never resorted to threats. Because she knew, in a place where power had been used like a weapon, dignity and truth were the only forces sharp enough to cut through. Back at the precinct, shock turned into reckoning. Officers who had grown used to fear-based obedience began asking questions. The deputy commissioner, once passive in the background, initiated a quiet reform. Ann Min, the young officer who had spoken up, was transferred not as punishment but as protection, placed into a program that nurtured whistleblowers and rising reformists. But perhaps the most profound shift was not inside government buildings, it was in the eyes of the people. At that very checkpoint, traffic still stopped, but now with clarity and calm. Drivers weren't bracing for extortion. They were showing papers, sometimes even exchanging a smile. A single mother on a motorbike once told a friend, "I don't know what changed, but I feel safe again." That was the legacy Agent Lean left. Not just the dismantling of a scheme but the quiet rebuilding of trust. And as she disappeared from the public eye, mission completed, one could almost believe she'd never existed at all. But she had. And everyone who had witnessed that day would never forget her. Not all heroes wear medals. Some walk alone beneath a gray sky, with a folder of truths and a heart too stubborn to surrender. In a world where corruption often hides behind polished uniforms and confident smiles, one young woman reminded us that real strength doesn't come from how loudly you speak, but from how deeply you stand in silence. Agent Lean didn't demand the spotlight. She didn't seek revenge. She simply believed that justice still mattered, and she acted when it counted. And perhaps that's what stays with us long after the video ends. Not just the image of her standing there, calm and unshaken, but the idea that any one of us, with the courage to do what's right, can hold even the most powerful to account. Because sometimes, it only takes one quiet voice to unravel a whole empire of lies. So the next time someone tells you it's useless to speak up, remember her. Remember the woman in gray, who didn't need permission to change everything. This is such an amazing story. Dear friends, if you liked the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is still a lot of interesting things to come.